Yɛresiesie, the Preparation for Reparations podcast, episode 11, Who Speaks for Us? Exposing Elite Capture of Afrikan Reparations. Welcome to the 11th episode of Yɛresiesie, the Preparation for Reparations podcast. I'm your host, Esther Xosei, Executive Director of the Maangamizi Educational Trust, the educational arm of the Stop the Maangamizi campaign, joined once again by my co-host, Brother Simeon. But let us first pour libations. We pour libation to the Creator of the heavens and the earth, and to our African ancestors and ancestresses who overstood that liberation cannot be led by those who benefit from our oppression. To our great revolutionaries, the likes of Asajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, who warned us that the face of neo-colonialism may appear friendly, but its purpose is unchanged. To the Honourable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, Amy Ashwood Garvey, Amy Jakes Garvey, and all Garveyites, who taught us that a people without knowledge of their past history, origin and culture is like a tree without roots, and that we must be the authors of our own liberation. To the Patrice Lumumbas of the world, who reminded us that genuine independence means rejecting the paternalism of former and contemporary colonisers. To Queen Mother Audley Moore, who demonstrated what grassroots reparation organising looks like when it emerges from our communities rather than being imposed from above. To our mamas like Ida B. Wells Barnett, who showed us that truth-telling requires independence from those who would silence our voices. To all of our ancestors and ancestresses who overstood that authentic representation means accountable leadership emerging from the oppressed and colonised, rather than being appointed by any of our oppressors. May our words honour their wisdom. May our works honour their legacy. Ashe, Ashe, Asheo.
Greetings, family. Last week, a delegation claiming to represent Caribbean reparations interests visited Westminster and Brussels to meet UK MPs and European parliamentarians. This delegation was organised and funded by Denis O'Brien, an Irish telecommunications billionaire, despite being presented as authentic Caribbean representation. These events have raised fundamental questions about authentic representation, grassroots representation, and who has the authority to speak for Caribbean and African peoples in reparations negotiations.
Yes, and these questions go to the heart of what we mean by Yɛresiesie, preparing ourselves for reparations. Because if we're not prepared to distinguish between authentic representation and elite manipulation, if we haven't developed criteria for evaluating who truly serves our liberation interests, then we remain vulnerable to having our struggle co-opted by the very forces we're organising against and resisting.
The recent visit by the Repair Campaign delegation to the UK and EU, followed by CARICOM's response, provides a perfect case study for examining these critical issues. After O'Brien's delegation completed their meetings in Westminster and Brussels, CARICOM's Reparations Commission issued a public statement distancing themselves from the initiative. Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, chair of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, declared that these persons who have arrived in Europe are neither members of the CRC nor formally affiliated with CARICOM. But what makes this particularly instructive is that this 2025 distancing statement appears disingenuous given CARICOM's enthusiastic endorsement of O'Brien's involvement since 2022.
Exactly, Brother Simeon. While the optics of a white Irish billionaire leading a reparations delegation are obviously problematic, we must dig deeper to understand how both CARICOM and the Repair Campaign fail to meet international law requirements for meaningful participation by affected communities and survivors of the Maangamizi, which is us, the people. This isn't about racial dynamics, though those are crucial, but it's about power structures that consistently exclude grassroots voices of our African heritage communities from decisions about our own reparations and liberation.
Today, we'll explore what authentic representation means in reparations organising, examine why the international legal framework requires genuine participation by affected communities, and develop criteria for distinguishing between reparations work that serves liberation versus reparations work that serves elite manipulation, regardless of the racial identity of the actors involved.
Because we must understand that authentic reparations is fundamentally about liberation, ending the systems of exploitation that is stopping the Maangamizi, rather than just compensating for its effects whilst the Maangamizi continues. When reparations processes exclude the very communities they claim to serve and their legitimate representatives, when they're controlled by elite actors who benefit from current power structures, they cannot achieve the transformation that genuine reparations require. Most importantly, we'll discuss how grassroots communities can protect ourselves from being misrepresented while building the autonomous power needed for genuine affecting and securing of holistic reparations. Because the question isn't just who speaks for us, but how do we develop our own voice loud enough that no one else needs to speak for us or even dare. And this is fundamentally about liberation. Reparations that doesn't challenge the power structures that created the need for reparations in the first place aren't really reparations at all. They're just more sophisticated forms of management and control.
The Repair Campaign controversy. Auntie Esther, let's start with the basic facts. What exactly happened with the Repair Campaign's recent lobbying efforts, and why did CARICOM feel compelled to issue such a clear distancing statement?
The Repair Campaign is funded by Irish telecommunications billionaire Denis O'Brien, as you stated. And of course, they organised this recent delegation that met with UK members of Parliament and EU parliamentarians in Westminster and Brussels, respectively. This delegation claimed to represent Caribbean interests in reparations negotiations, and they also spoke of what they called 15 fully costed economic and social development plans, or what we might popularly say are reparations plans, supposedly aligned with CARICOM's 10-point plan. What's revealing about this delegation is how O'Brien positioned himself at the centre while surrounding himself with Caribbean academics who provided a degree of legitimacy. According to David Fox's July 4th, 2025 article in Caribbean Media, the delegation included Professor Jean-Marie Theodore, Don Marshall from the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute, Professor Cynthia Barrow-Giles, and other respected scholars, but O'Brien was identified as the primary spokesperson. In his statement to the media, O'Brien is reported to have said, "It has been heartening to see the support that exists for reparations, both in the European and UK parliaments. I look forward to building on these meetings in the coming months." But notice the language. Again, reportedly, he said, I look forward, not we look forward, or the Caribbean delegation looks forward. This reveals perhaps how O'Brien might see himself as the driving force. This reveals perhaps how O'Brien might see himself as the driving force, with Caribbean academics serving supporting cast members in his initiative. But the reach of O'Brien's influence extends much deeper into UK politics than just these high-profile meetings that occurred recently. In July 2023, the Repair Campaign advertised for a reparations campaign coordinator on a £50,000 contract to work specifically targeting UK organisations and individuals. The job description reveals the sophisticated nature of this operation. Stakeholder mapping, coordinating parliamentary interventions and briefing ministers, running joint activities with relevant APPGs, which are all-party parliamentary groups, and creation of manifesto arcs targeted at all mainstream political parties. Literally a lobbyist. This wasn't, however, just lobbying. This was systematic infrastructure building to influence reparations discourse in the UK, and I guess by extension Europe. The position required at least 5 years of relevant work experience in strategic lobbying and involved partnership building to create a coalition of government ministers, political parties and civil society organisations. The advert explicitly stated the role involved working for both the Repair Campaign and Clive Lewis MP, who serves as Vice Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Afrikan Reparations. This raises critical questions about what O'Brien's well-funded operation has meant for minimising grassroots reparations work. Campaign formations like the Stop the Maangamizi campaign have been building authentic community-based reparations, organising and mobilising for over a decade without billionaire backing, of course. So when someone with O'Brien's resources enters the space with £50,000 to offer for professional lobbying contracts, systematic stakeholder mapping and coordinated parliamentary interventions, it can easily overshadow the patient, long-standing work of building genuine grassroots capacity. The danger is that politicians and media begin to see O'Brien's well-funded initiatives as the serious reparations work, while treating community-based organising as less significant or professional. This represents what writer and activist Arundhati Roy calls NGOisation, the process by which radical political movements get transformed into professionalised, bureaucratised, funded organisations that serve elite interests rather than grassroots liberation. Roy argues that NGOisation sucks up the oxygen from authentic resistance movements by creating the illusion of organised opposition while actually managing and containing dissent. When billionaire-funded operations like O'Brien's present themselves as professional reparations advocacy, they establish new standards for what counts as legitimate organising. Standards that require external funding, professional credentials, and elite approval rather than grassroots accountability and autonomous power building.
So, does this represent elite capture, not only of the cause, but of those that could potentially help bring about change?
Absolutely. Not only elite capture, we might talk about movement capture, and in some cases it's appropriate to talk about state capture, but let's just focus on elite capture for now. Elite capture is the process by which liberation movements, and we would say the struggle for African reparations, is a movement itself, But it's where these movements get taken over and controlled by elite actors, whether they're academics or, business elites or political elites, who have the resources, who have the establishment credentials or institutional access to position themselves as leaders, even when they don't represent the communities that they claim to serve. And in this case, we're talking about survivors of the Maangamizi. Elite capture doesn't usually happen through force. It happens through sophisticated processes that make the takeover appear legitimate and beneficial. This creates what Arundhati Roy calls a government-approved form of politics, where reparations organising will become acceptable to existing power structures precisely because it doesn't challenge those structures fundamentally. The O'Brien model represents exactly this NGOisation of reparations resistance, or what we might even say is Maangamizi resistance, transforming demands for structural transformation into professionally managed development programs that maintain dependency relationships while appearing progressive.
Okay, and in going back to the timeline, it does reveal something much more problematic than, say, a simple agreement between the organisations. Firstly, it suggests that the leadership of CARICOM actively facilitated O'Brien's leadership role until it became politically inconvenient. What we're seeing here fits perfectly with what Amilcar Cabral analysed as how colonial education creates leaders who return to the source in name only while maintaining colonial mentalities in practice. Cabral warned that some African intellectuals become more Greek than the Greeks, more committed to European validation than Europeans themselves. When CARICOM welcomed O'Brien in 2022, but distanced themselves in 2025, this wasn't a change in principles, but a change in public relations strategy. The fundamental approach remained the same: elite management of reparations processes without meaningful grassroots participation.
Precisely. And this exposes how elite co-optation operates. Not through crude takeover, but through sophisticated collaboration between different elite factions. So when O'Brien first proposed his quote-unquote repair plan in 2022, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles didn't appear to question whether a white Irish billionaire should lead Caribbean reparations efforts. Instead, he celebrated O'Brien's potential to influence quote-unquote high-level government relations with European powers. But here's what makes this particularly revealing. O'Brien's involvement didn't begin just this year. In October 2022, CARICOM's Reparations Commission enthusiastically welcomed O'Brien's proposals. Professor Sir Hilary Beckles praised O'Brien's repair plan, saying it would help build momentum in support of CARICOM's call for reparations, and had the potential to engage in high-level government relations with the UK, Europe and the European Union. But then just last week, when the O'Brien delegation visited Westminster and Brussels claiming to represent Caribbean interests, CARICOM, Reparations Commission, felt compelled to issue a public statement distancing themselves. Beckles declared that these persons who have arrived in Europe are neither members of the CRC, that is the CARICOM Reparations Commission, nor formally affiliated. The same Professor Sir Hilary Beckles who had publicly endorsed O'Brien's involvement just 3 years earlier. So this recent distancing statement doesn't address the fundamental problems with participatory democracy. It just manages public relations after the contradictions become too obvious to ignore. This reveals how both CARICOM and the Repair Campaign represent different faces of the same elite-driven approach that fails to meet international law requirements for meaningful participation by affected communities, that is, survivors of the Maangamizi.
Now, the endorsements from Beckles and Professor Vereen Shepherd that appear on the Repair Campaign website seem to legitimize O'Brien's role while providing cover for what you're describing as intellectual colonialism.
Yes, people should check out the Repair Campaign website. You can Google it. I'm not going to give them free publicity. And those endorsements, which there is an endorsement from both Professor Sir Hilary Beckles and Professor Vereen Shepherd, these reveal how academic elites can become gatekeepers who validate external intervention in grassroots initiated movements. So when Professor Sir Hilary Beckles endorses O'Brien's approach as consistent with the CARICOM perspective, and Shepherd commends his financial contribution to Caribbean repair, these are wording taken from the website endorsements, they're not just offering support, they're providing establishment academic credentials that make elite co-optation appear legitimate. But we must ask, did these endorsements emerge from community assemblies where Caribbean peoples evaluated O'Brien's proposals in terms of the repair campaign, or were they decisions made by individual academics or political leaders based on their own assessments? The process matters as much as the content, because it reveals whether communities have had genuine decision-making power. Moreover, when O'Brien claims to have consulted 280 different interest groups across the Caribbean, we need to examine what kind of consultation this was. Was it meaningful participation, where communities could shape or reject or otherwise influence his proposals? Or was it extractive consultation, where communities and community members provided information that O'Brien and his team then used to design programs or plans, socio-economic plans, according to his or their own priorities?
What strikes me about O'Brien's statement at the 2023 Canto Conference, that's the Caribbean Association of National Telecommunications Organizations annual gathering, is how they reveal classic colonial paternalism dressed up as progressive development thinking. When he was reported as saying that countries in the Caribbean need to become knowledge-based countries, he positions himself as the expert who understands Caribbean development requirements better than the Caribbean people themselves. This connects to what Professor Walter Rodney exposed in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, the assumption that European knowledge and leadership are necessary for African development, even when the same European exploitation created the underdevelopment in the first place. Listeners, please pay attention to this language pattern. When someone says, you need to become, or your community should, ask yourself, who gave them the authority to determine what you need?
Exactly. And notice how O'Brien, certainly in reported public statements that we can find in the media, frames reparations as technical development assistance, diversifying economies and becoming knowledge-based, rather than addressing the power imbalances that enable ongoing exploitation and dispossession as a result of the Maangamizi of neocolonialism. This reduces reparations to management consulting rather than justice. Moreover, O'Brien's focus on diversifying economies and becoming knowledge-based countries frames reparations as technical development assistance rather than addressing the fundamental power imbalances created by colonialism. His approach maintains Caribbean dependency on European goodwill and resources, stolen resources I dare say, while offering reforms that preserve those same extractive relationships. when O'Brien is reported as saying, "We are working with the UE, that is the University of the West Indies, and 15 governments to develop a bespoke plan of investments that will be submitted to the British government." The power dynamic is clear. Caribbean institutions provide legitimacy and content, but the ultimate audience is the British government, reproducing the same pattern where the Caribbean needs are filtered through European approval rather than being demands backed by autonomous power building of the African heritage communities still living in the Caribbean. Most telling is O'Brien's insistence that the campaign is not anti-British and is about making good for what happened in the past. This reveals his approach as being about reconciliation rather than justice, seeking to repair relationships with former colonizers, but what kind of relationships, rather than transforming the power structures that have enabled our people's colonization.
Okay, so we've got an issue here. We speak of power dynamics, and we've already identified O'Brien's plan to develop a bespoke series of actions and investments that will be submitted to the British government. So this, in essence, reproduces the colonial relationship where Caribbean need must be filtered through European validation.
And this connects to the deeper theft happening here. So O'Brien claims to have initiated repair work. That is, it is called the Repair Campaign. If you look on his website, again, you can Google it and find it. He claims that this is his initiative. However, the concept of reparations as comprehensive repair has been developed over decades, and we could actually say centuries, by scholar activists like Professor Chinwezu and the broader Pan-African movement. This is intellectual colonialism, taking concepts developed by colonized peoples and rebranding them as innovations by the colonizer class. So I want those of you listening to pause right now and think, has this happened in your organizing? Has someone with more resources or establishment credentials, even academic qualifications, taken credit for ideas that have come from you or your organization or your community? How did that make you feel? And what did that do to you or your organization or maybe the movement you're part of? But to better understand how this theft succeeds and in fact gets normalized, we need Fanon's, that's Frantz Fanon's analysis of the national middle class. He predicted that Caribbean elites would become intermediaries, not building independent power, but serving as transmission lines between the nation and capitalism. So when Professor Sir Hilary Beckles and Professor Vereen Shepherd provide endorsements, as they have done, for O'Brien's repair initiatives, they're fulfilling exactly this intermediary role, in my opinion. They're not victims, they're willing participants who see external funding and validation, I guess, from people like Denis O'Brien as preferable to grassroots accountability from African heritage communities, where we have substantive representation, which is where we have representation of African values and value systems, principles, value systems, ethics systems, and so forth.
So are you saying that not so long ago, circa 100 years, Fanon also predicted that these elites would be more hostile to independent grassroots organizing than to external control?
Yeah, that's exactly what we can deduce from rereading the works of people like Frantz Fanon. Figures like Beckles and Shepherd appear to feel more, perhaps, I wouldn't necessarily say threatened, but certainly there has been some degree of, I would say, hostility to campaigning formations like the Stop the Maangamizi campaign and coalitions like PARCO, who in 2013 came out with the only kind of critical standpoint on the Caribbean Reparations Initiative, which went on to become the CARICOM 10-point plan. And we were very much condemned for doing so. We were considered to be pouring, I don't know, cold water on what some people were seeing as a really great thing, that Caribbean governments were taking up reparations after, some civil society organisations, including organisations like the Global African Congress, which I used to be part of and, as you know, co-founded, had been lobbying. They would tell you, Caribbean leaders, heads of government, to take up reparations for a long time. But it seems that there is more willingness to engage with groups like the heirs of slavery or enslavement, I'm not sure which they call themselves now, and the Laura Trevelyan's of this world, and many others who are well known, who, have been granted honorary PhDs and all kinds of things, rather than connecting with independent grassroots organisers, especially here in Europe, but specifically in the UK, considering that they are targeting the British state in particular. But partly this is because independent grassroots work, where we're able to critique constructively on the basis of analysis, rigorous analysis, and also studying the works of our ancestors who really, predicted all of this, threatens the intermediary role of some of the academics' elites.
O'Brien's Haiti or Haiti record and the repair deception. O'Brien's history in the Caribbean, particularly in Haiti, provides crucial context. Can you walk us through what his salvation actually meant for Haitian people?
After the devastating 2010 Haiti earthquake that killed over 200,000 people, O'Brien positioned himself as Haiti's saviour through charitable donations and reconstruction projects. Apparently, he donated about $5 million to Haiti relief and pledged to reconstruct the Marché Enfer. Media praised him as Haiti's only hope of salvation. But here's a question for our listeners. When disaster strikes in your community, who shows up claiming to help? And whose interests do their solutions actually serve? What O'Brien's salvation actually meant was using disaster relief to further entrench Digicel's business presence. He launched text-to-donate campaigns that fused his corporate image with humanitarian causes, then invested over $48 million US dollars in a Marriott hotel that served international elites rather than addressing Haitian people's fundamental needs. Scholar activist Ryan Cecil Jobson calls this reparations top-up schemes that suppress the dignity of ordinary people to govern themselves on their own authority, while creating elite enclaves and leisure canopies.
Now, this pattern seems to connect directly with Fanon's analysis of how the national bourgeoisie serves Western capital interests. How does O'Brien's Haiti experience illuminate his current reparations work?
The pattern is identical: extractive business relationships disguised as philanthropy, top-down development that serves elite interests, and the marginalisation of grassroots voices in favour of what Jobson calls elite cadres of private sector financiers, consultants and scholars. Fanon warned that the national bourgeoisie would organise centres of rest and relaxation and pleasure resorts to meet the wishes of the Western bourgeoisie. O'Brien's Marriott Hotel investment in Haiti represents exactly this pattern, creating luxury spaces for international elites while the broader population remain marginalised. But what's most insidious is how O'Brien's repair model has been legitimised by respected, or so-called respected, institutions. Jobson notes the irony that CARICOM governments closing ranks to support an armed intervention of Haiti while partnering with a chief architect of its disintegration. This reveals how Caribbean elite collaboration can reproduce the very exploitation that reparations should address. The fundamental question that Jobson raises is whether we want reparations top-up that maintains existing power structures or genuine self-determination that builds autonomous community power.
The composition of O'Brien's delegation reveals something about how co-optation creates divisions within liberation movements. Originally, Professor Vereen Shepherd was supposed to lead this delegation, but somehow O'Brien ended up as the primary spokesperson with Caribbean academics in supporting roles. This isn't just about logistics. It's about how some members of the CARICOM Reparations Commission can be seduced by external funding and international platforms, even when this compromises movement independence. These aren't victims of manipulation. They're willing participants who prefer working with well-funded external actors over building authentic grassroots capacity. What's particularly troubling is that figures like Beckles and Shepherd often show more hostility towards independent grassroots organising than towards white billionaire control over reparations processes.
This reveals the class dynamics Fanon predicted. When grassroots organisations develop independent analysis, this threatens the intermediary role that provides these academics with status and resources. But when O'Brien offers international platforms and resourcing, this enhances their intermediary function rather than challenges it.
Amilcar Cabral warned about intellectuals who return to the source in name only. Amilcar Cabral warned about intellectuals who return to the source only in name while maintaining colonial mentalities. That's exactly what we're seeing. Caribbean academics who sound radical but are more comfortable with Irish billionaire approval than grassroots accountability. The painful truth is that some Caribbean intellectuals cannot stand grassroots independence because it reveals the limitations of their elite-focused approaches and threatens their position as authorized voices of Caribbean reparations.
This is where our analysis must become more sophisticated than simply just opposing the repair campaign while supporting CARICOM. Both initiatives represent what we can call elite-driven models that fail to meet international law requirements for meaningful participation by affected communities, despite their apparent differences and seeming public disagreements, if you can actually read between the lines. So the 2022 embrace and now 2025, distancing in terms of the recent statement from Professor Sir Hilary Beckles in his capacity of chairman of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, reveal how elite politics operates. Different factions may disagree on tactics or even optics, while sharing fundamental assumptions about who has the right to make decisions about reparations. Neither O'Brien's philanthro-capitalistic approach nor CARICOM's governmental approach provides genuine decision-making power to the grassroots communities most impacted by the Maangamizi.
International law and participatory reparations. You've mentioned that both CARICOM and the Repair Campaign fail to meet international law requirements for participatory reparations. Can you explain what these requirements are and why they matter for authentic reparations organising?
International human rights law has evolved significantly around the principle of participation, particularly through the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The principle is clear. Affected communities must have meaningful participation in decisions that affect them, not just consultation or representation by others. For reparations specifically, this means that the descendants of enslaved Africans and other colonized peoples must have genuine decision-making power outside of the state in determining what forms of repair are appropriate, how they should be implemented, and who should oversee or lead the process. This goes far beyond having government officials or NGO leaders speak on behalf of communities.
What does meaningful participation look like in practice? This seems like it could be interpreted quite broadly.
Absolutely, and I want those listening to become participation detectives. So here's a challenge for this week. So this week, for those of you who are listening, pay attention to one meeting or decision-making process you're part of, maybe at work, in your community-based organisation or your community setting, even in your family, wherever. Evaluate it using the 4 A's. Access. Could everyone affected by the decision actually participate? Were there barriers like timing, location, language, cost, or assumed knowledge that excluded people? Agency. Did participants have real power to shape the agenda and options? Or were they just choosing between predetermined alternatives? Authority. Were the community decisions binding, or could they be overruled by management, funders, or other authorities? And accountability. Could participants withdraw support or redirect the process if their interests weren't being served? So after you've evaluated that one process, for those listening, I want you to ask yourselves, am I really participating, or am I being consulted while others maintain decision-making power? Then, and this is crucial, share what you've discovered with 2 other people. Don't just keep this analysis to yourself. Start conversations about what genuine participation would look like in your context. This isn't an academic exercise. When you start recognizing authentic versus fake participation in local contexts, you'll be much better equipped to evaluate international reparations processes and hold organizations and institutions accountable to higher standards that you have a right to.
The concept of free, prior, and informed consent from Indigenous rights frameworks seems relevant here. How does this principle apply to Caribbean and African reparations contexts?
Free, prior, and informed consent is absolutely fundamental to authentic reparations processes. But I want those listening to understand how to apply this in their own lives first. So free means without coercion, manipulation, or bribery. Communities must be able to reject reparative measures, programs, plans, or initiatives without facing punishment or exclusion from other benefits. Prior means before implementation, not after decisions have already been made by others. Communities cannot meaningfully consent to processes they discover only after they've begun. And informed means having access to all relevant information. in languages and formats communities can overstand, including the full implications of different choices and alternatives that exist. So here's an exercise for those that are listening. Think about a major decision affecting your community that was made in the last year. Maybe it was a workplace policy, maybe it was school changes or a housing development, whatever. And ask yourself these 3 questions. Were you free to reject it without consequences? Were you consulted prior to the decision being finalised? And were you fully informed about all of the options and implications? So if you answered no to any of these, you experienced what we call colonial consent, the appearance of consultation without real decision-making power. Now here's the challenge. Identify one upcoming decision that will affect you and your community this week. Practice demanding free, prior and informed consent. Don't just accept whatever process they offer. Ask, how can we ensure everyone affected can participate freely? How can we be involved before final decisions? What information do we need to make informed choices? And when you practice demanding genuine consent in local contexts, you develop the skills and the confidence needed to evaluate whether international reparations processes respect community decision-making power or just create the appearance of doing so.
How do power imbalances affect the possibility of genuine consent? When former colonial powers control the resources for reparations, can affected communities ever truly consent freely?
This question goes to the heart of why reparations requires transformation rather than just focusing on compensation within the status quo. When former colonisers maintain economic and political power over formerly colonised peoples, any reparations they offer will be designed to preserve their own interests rather than genuinely stopping the harm and repairing that harm that they have caused. Think about it. If Britain, that is the British state, controls the terms, the timeline and quantum for Caribbean peoples, that is African peoples in the Caribbean region I'm speaking of specifically, although in a Caribbean context we also would recognise the native communities, native genocide, and also I know communities coming from India have also been making their own advocacy points on them being included. But if this happens, then the British state can ensure that whatever reparations are being advocated for never threaten British economic interests, which would probably be quite global. You know, you don't just look at here in the UK, we have to look at the global interests. So they might offer development aid, symbolic apologies, or even financial payments, but only in ways that maintain Caribbean dependency on British goodwill and resources, which we know a lot have been acquired literally through extractivism from Africa and other parts of the global south. So true reparations would mean that peoples in the Caribbean would have the autonomous power to determine what repair looks like for them. And it can't just be a Caribbean repair because of the different peoples that make up that region today and their different experiences of the Maangamizi and different types of colonization. So not only determining what repair looks like, but how repair should be implemented, what transformations are necessary to not only stop the harm of today, but also prevent future harms. But that level of self-determination threatens the very systems that continue to benefit former colonial powers. This is why initiatives like Ma'atubuntu Man that we discussed in our last episode become necessary, creating sufficient autonomous power for African and diaspora communities that we can negotiate as equals from a position of strength and being unified as much as possible, rather than being supplicants. Without this power base, even well-intentioned reparations processes can only reproduce dependency relationships.
Global patterns and reparations washing. This pattern of elite co-optation seems to connect to broader global trends. Are we seeing similar dynamics in other people's reparation struggles, and how does this connect to the broader African reparations movement worldwide?
We must be clear that Caribbean reparations cannot stand alone. People in the Caribbean, or the majority population there at least, are part of the global African reparations movement. The colonial borders imposed by European powers deliberately fragmented African people, and we cannot allow reparations organising to reproduce those same divisions. Think about this, for those who are listening. When you hear terms like Caribbean reparations movement and African reparations movement or African reparations, whose interest does this separation serve? Who benefits when we organise separately instead of as one global African family, considering the Caribbean case is premised on not only native genocide, but African chattel enslavement for the majority population of the region today? When we examine global patterns, we see how fragmentation serves colonial interests. CARICOM negotiates separately from continental African governments, and certainly I would, include here or put first movements, okay? So while different African countries compete for European investment rather than building unified demands, this allows former colonial powers to manage separate regional demands for repair instead of facing coordinated African power. Indigenous scholars have identified reparations washing, where programs actually solidify colonial extractivist Maangamizi relationships rather than transforming them. We see this globally, from the Gates Foundation control over African health policy to corporate quote-unquote development programs that maintain dependency while appearing benevolent.
The Indigenous analysis reveals 9 dangers of elite-controlled reparations. How do these apply to what we're seeing with O'Brien?
So I would say, in particular, if we think about scholars like Jeff Kornstrassel and Cindy Holder, who write a lot about Native American reparations, there are 3 key dangers that stand out. I'd say first, commodifying harms. So O'Brien's fully costed development plans put a price tag on centuries of the Maangamizi. Second, failing to address structural oppression. So his approach maintains Caribbean dependency on European approval from the British state and other British institutions. Third, not challenging capitalism. So the solutions being put forward by O'Brien preserve the systems his own wealth depends on and in fact has been generated in. So again, a challenge for our listeners. Look at any situation being offered to us, to our people, to you, your community. Does it challenge the system that created the problem? Or does it help that system to simply run more smoothly, or to deceive us into thinking that the system is is actually granting us our desires or wishes or what we're entitled to, whilst really just doing some symbolic window dressing. The scholars Jeff Kornstassel and Cindy Holder identify a crucial danger as well, that reparations can quickly be taken over by elites who have knowledge, and these elites dictate the terms of the struggle rather than involving the peoples who have suffered human rights violations. So yes, the elites have a particular type of knowledge that might gain more currency in a system like this. And this perfectly describes what I can see in terms of O'Brien's repair campaign operation. He positions himself, from what I can see, and again, don't just take my word for it. Those listening, go and do your own research. Go and Google. You can find these things out for yourselves. So he positions himself as having superior knowledge about Caribbean development needs, while Caribbean academics like Professor Sir Hilary Beckles and Professor Vereen Shepherd appear to provide legitimacy, or certainly have done in the past, for his elite-dictated terms. The 280 consultations O'Brien claims to have conducted, I mean, not him personally, but the repair campaign that he initiated, have conducted what we could call political expedience rather than genuine participation.
The most important lesson is that we're witnessing global counter-strategy by elite institutions to capture and neutralize reparations demands before they achieve their transformative potential. Just as indigenous land-back movements get channeled into reconciliation processes, Caribbean reparations are being channeled into diplomatic processes and development programs that maintain dependency relationships. What makes this more particularly dangerous is that these elite interventions often succeed in dividing liberation movement. Communities facing immediate needs may see elite resources as beneficial, while others recognize the long-term costs of accepting elite control. These divisions weaken our collective capacity for autonomous organizing just when we need it the most. The O'Brien phenomenon isn't unique to the Caribbean. It represents how philanthropic capital increasingly positions itself as the solution to problems created by capitalist exploitation.
Exactly, and Fanon's genius was recognizing that the form of intermediary relationship matters less than its function. So whether it's government-to-government diplomacy or private philanthropy, if the fundamental structure maintains dependency in the Caribbean on European goodwill, looted resources that need to be restituted to us, and institutional frameworks, then the intermediary functions remain unchanged. This is why the recent distancing that we saw in the statement from Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, really distancing from the O'Brien delegation, the repair campaign delegation that are visiting the UK at this time, what Fanon called the apparent strength of the bourgeoisie, that is, creating the illusion of independence while maintaining the same structural relationship. So the distancing allows CARICOM, or setting the records straight, to say it's not us, because they've been getting, media reports and I guess requests for interviews, and it's like the focus is not on them. The focus is on Denis O'Brien and the repair campaign and whatever they're saying and doing. But this distancing allows CARICOM to appear autonomous while continuing to operate within colonial institutional frameworks, or let's say even neo-colonial institutional frameworks, seeking validation from the colonial class and their descendants, let's put it that way. The solution is what Fanon called closing the road to the national bourgeoisie, building grassroots capacity that makes elite intermediation unnecessary. When communities have their own resources, and though, that have been restituted to them, that they've been denied access to over centuries, analysis and decision-making processes they become less vulnerable to co-optation, regardless of how sophisticated the elite interventions become.
What's particularly revealing about O'Brien's operation is how it reproduces exactly what Professor Wangari Maathai warned about, the creation of what she called briefcase environmentalists. What's particularly these are people who carry projects from funder to funder rather than building real community power. O'Brien's £50,000 lobbying contracts and fully costed development plans create the same dynamic. Professional reparations advocates who speak with the language of justice but depend on elite funding rather than grassroots accountability. Their technical expertise becomes a way to exclude the very communities who should be leading these processes.
And this connects to why the Indigenous analysis is so important. It gives us practical tools for recognizing when our movements are being captured, regardless of how progressive the language sounds. And however much it may appear that reparationists or those advocating for reparations sound like each other or are fighting on the same side.
Building authentic representation. How do these divisions affect the broader reparations movement, and what can grassroots communities do to navigate these tensions?
These divisions serve elite interests by fragmenting our movements, ultimately movements from below that have been initiated by the people below, especially those who were marginalized in society. And in this case, we're talking about the Caribbean, so let's just talk about Rastafari and how many Caribbean governments treated Rastafari and who were demonized, who were criminalized and persecuted, and even there were various massacres against devotees in that sense, right? And others in kind of what would be called Black Power movements. We only need to look at the track record. But yet, some of these same governmental institutions are the ones shouting the loudest because obviously they have access to state power or white power still in a state form, but with black faces, whereby their voices will be heard more. Yeah, because in many of these countries there's no real totally independent press, so you're relying on whatever might be the common publications, news publications, what have you, to tell your story. And if the story is oppositional or considered to be oppositional to those who are considered to be the leaders or the experts or the knowledge, the ones who hold the knowledge, then it means those stories are not going to be amplified very far. Okay? So while we debate whether to work with the repair campaign, and when I say we, I don't mean us, as in terms of the Maangamizi Educational Trust and the Stop the Maangamizi campaign, but I'm talking about our people, because, for instance, this whole past week, there's been so much talk about this delegation's visit, and many people, especially what we would call African Caribbean people, are jumping up on reparations now. Everybody's talking about reparations in the Caribbean, and some of this same class of people, of which, we are all part, actually, involved in this podcast, would have, run a mile from reparations 15, 20 years ago, right? Because it was considered to be a fringe issue of nationalism, Pan-Africanists, and what would have been considered extremists and nutters and loonies and so forth. But yet now, all of these people, with their respectability politics, they're talking or advocating for reparations because the grassroots movements through blood, sweat and tears and assassinations of many of our leaders, let's not forget, have made reparations a household word and have made it palatable, whereby now people who are well positioned are just literally positioning themselves to get some of these NGO jobs and get the funding that is available that is still being denied to those who need the resourcing the most and who have been keeping this issue alive. So I'm just challenging our listeners to think about divisions that they've experienced as part of their own organising and mobilising. Do you find yourselves spending more energy being in conflict or opposition to other community groups who are meant to be championing the same cause, like reparations, rather than challenging the system oppressing all of us, all of you? If so, who benefits from those divisions? Who benefits when we don't support a campaign strategy that is calling, among other things, for an all-party parliamentary commission of inquiry so that all of those working on reparations can have their say and can talk about the proposals that they have, the solutions they're working on, as opposed to just saying, we are the one organisation and we are the way, the truth and the life, of the truth and the light of reparations, and none will get there but through us, which is the mentality of some reparations organisations and so-called leaders that I've come across. Yeah, it becomes very, very competitive and hierarchical and literally changing one oppressor for another.
This brings us to a crucial question. What does authentic representation look like in practice? How can our listeners distinguish between real community leadership and sophisticated manipulation?
So I think it's important for those listening to develop authenticity literacy using 3 questions. First, where does the funding and resourcing come from? If O'Brien's telecommunications empire profits from current Caribbean-European relationships, how can this funding transform those relationships? Second, who really makes the decision? So the repair campaign operates without any Caribbean grassroots mandate. And by Caribbean, I'm particularly emphasising the role of African heritage communities in the Caribbean, people racialised as black. Our communities have no voice in the repair campaign. And honestly, they've got no voice in CARICOM 10-point plan either, although I know and have to say that the CARICOM 10-point plan has been updated, and yes, they have got input from different people in the region. But again, people in the region who are operating at a certain level and who would be considered acceptable representatives, that I wouldn't say everybody is more palatable, but it's not everybody that would kind of even be invited into some of these meetings and processes. Third, what are the long-term goals? Do they challenge or preserve existing power relations? But as we know, there is this uncomfortable truth. Caribbean communities have no voice in CARICOM's reparations plans either, really. I mean, the wider masses. Many of them don't even know what's going on in their countries. And even where there are national reparations committees or commissions or councils, the role of ordinary people is limited. And obviously we know that not everyone can necessarily sit around a negotiating table, but certainly the education that needs to be supported and catalysed, so people are aware of their rights, people are aware of what is at stake, people are aware of what this means for them and their families, and that people can have a say in the kind of reparatory justice changes they would like to see. Okay? So for me, what we're seeing here is that, whether it's the O'Brien philanthro-capitalistic approach or the CARICOM's governmental approach, both are operating as elite-driven processes. Yeah? So we know that the CARICOM 10-point plan, for instance, wasn't developed in a participatory way. For me, this reveals why O'Brien's repair campaign could gain a degree of legitimacy in the region so easily. It operates using the same elite exclusion model that characterises most official reparations processes, especially when they are state-led or top-down. The difference isn't that one includes grassroots voices while the other doesn't. The difference is which elite faction is controlling the process and which one are people supposed to get behind.
Beyond those three questions, how can our listeners develop a more comprehensive framework for evaluating authentic representation?
So, we're putting forward something called the Liberation Authenticity Framework. So this is, 7 criteria for evaluating whether any individual or organisation or institution claiming to represent your interests, our people's interests, actually serve liberation. In terms of reparations as liberation, right? No reparations without liberation, rather than co-opting the cause. So emergence, did they come from your community? Are they known? Do they have a track record of being engaged on these issues? And for how long? And what positions they were taking? Lots of people take the position of being pro-reparations, but quite frankly, some reparations positions reinforce white supremacy, or they're conservative, or they are anti-people, or they reinforce particular forms of Eurocentric knowledge, or even status within European societies, right? And those who get validated in particular ways. Accountability. Can you withdraw support? What mechanisms are there to actually hear your perspectives on the issue? Resource independence. So where are the resources coming from? Who's controlling them? Yeah? Decision-making authority. Who's really deciding? And on behalf of whom are they deciding? Yeah, because many people might be coming from the grassroots, but they're speaking for themselves. Me, myself, and I. Who has mandated any of us to negotiate for generations of our lineage, literally, because we see things a particular way? But who do we speak for? And even in families, you normally have some type of recognition of eldership, or who has, if you like, more of the moral mandate, the ethical kind of standing to be able to speak to or represent that family's interests. Yeah? That's why we've been promoting the Ma'atso as a jurors. So I'm still on this 7 criteria. So we've had the emergence, the accountability, resource independence, decision-making authority, transformative vision. Is it reformist? Is it revolutionary? Is it transformational? Capacity building. Are we getting stronger? Are you building capacity? Yeah, to be the change in your families, in your roads, in the area in which you live, in your area. And cultural integrity. Are our values, principles and values, the best of what our people have shaped and made as part of our sojourn? Are they recognised? Are they guiding what we're doing? Whose mind, whose idea of repair is guiding our actions? Our ancestors? Or those which our ancestors may even reject today, because they would see us as being in bed with our colonizers, our enslavers, our torturers. But yet many of us feel that somehow when we get validations by them, whether it's the MBEs, the OBEs, whatever, that somehow we've made it. Yeah? And it's important to really examine these 7 criteria, okay? And not only examine it, but analyze it. Start a conversation with someone else about what you discovered. Ask them to do the same, to evaluate their own experiences. And then it's for us to determine, are we building authentic representation in our communities, or are we reproducing patterns of elite domination, even with good intentions, or even at the grassroots? Yeah? And many of us could perhaps be seen, or maybe be even accused of that, in terms of whose voices are being heard.
As we conclude this examination of authentic representation in reparations organising, several crucial lessons must emerge from the repair campaign controversy. The fundamental issue isn't just whether Denis O'Brien should lead reparations initiatives, but whether any elite-driven approach can achieve the participatory justice that international law requires and that our communities deserve. What becomes clear is that both governmental and philanthropic approaches to reparations can produce colonial power dynamics if they don't ensure meaningful grassroots participation. The solution isn't choosing between elite factions, but building autonomous community capacity for self-representation.
Most importantly, this controversy provides an opportunity for grassroots communities to clarify our own criteria for authentic representation and to strengthen our capacity for independent analysis and taking of action. When we can clearly distinguish between liberation organising and elite manipulation, we become much harder to co-opt. So the criteria that we've discussed, emergence, accountability, resource independence, decision-making authority, transformative vision, capacity building and cultural integrity, provide practical tools for evaluating any organisation, institution or individual claiming to represent our people's interest.
This week, take one of these 3 actions. Don't wait until you understand everything perfectly. Start where you are, with what you have, and with who you know. First, identify 3 people in your community who share your concerns about justice and self-determination. Don't wait for the perfect people or the perfect conditions. Just 3 people who care about fairness and community power. Invite them to form a small study circle to discuss these issues using the criteria we've outlined. Meet for coffee, meet in someone's living room, meet virtually. Just start talking about what authentic representation looks like in your contexts. Second, research one organisation currently claiming to represent your interests. Apply our 7 criteria: emergence, accountability, resource independence, decision-making authority, transformative vision, capacity building, and cultural integrity. Write down what this analysis reveals. Don't just think about it, actually write it down. Third, identify one area where you could begin practicing participatory decision-making in your immediate context. Maybe your family, workplace, community organisation, or friend group. What would it look like to ensure everyone affected by the decisions has meaningful input into making them? Don't try to revolutionize everything at once. Just practice genuine consultation in one small area of your life.
But here's the most important part. Don't do this alone. Share your discoveries, your reasonings, your reflections with others. Every conversation you have about authentic representation makes our entire community stronger and harder to manipulate. Remember that every act of authentic representation in local context prepares us for the larger challenges of international reparations organising. Every time we insist on accountability and meaningful participation, we are asserting Yɛresiesie yenho, preparing ourselves for the comprehensive reparations and transformation that we deserve. And every time you insist on accountability from those claiming to represent your interests, locally, nationally and internationally, you're making it harder for elite manipulation to succeed anywhere. This week, take one of these three actions. Don't wait until you understand everything perfectly. Start where you are, with what you have, with who you know, then come back and listen to this episode again. I guarantee you'll hear things you missed the first time because you'll be listening with the ears of someone who has begun their own authenticity journey. Remember, every ancestor that we honoured in our libation had to take that first step, often without knowing how their actions would contribute to our freedom. Now it's our turn to take steps whose full impact we may never see, but that will absolutely contribute to the liberation and total emancipation of generations yet to come.
This is
Esther Xosei
and Brother Simeon on behalf of the Maangamizi Educational Trust, reminding you that when we build authentic grassroots representation, we are practicing Yɛresiesie yenho. We are preparing ourselves for reparations that truly transform rather than preserve existing power relations. Thanks to Brother Daniel Kofi, our technical assistant, for all your support.
Join us next time as we continue our exploration of Ubuntu Dunia, the pluriversal world that is the anti-imperialist, multipolar, pluriversal world of global justice for all that transcends mere multipolarity. Today's analysis of authentic representation versus elite manipulation provides crucial groundwork for understanding how Ubuntu Dunia differs from current unipolar domination and emerging multipolar alternatives that still reproduce other power hierarchies. We'll examine how this vision of a decolonial world, where many worlds fit, emerges directly from the kind of grassroots organising and people-to-people organising that we've discussed today, and what it means for transforming not just power relations, but the very foundations of how human societies organise ourselves to effect and secure holistic justice, sustainability, and collective flourishing. The Repair Campaign controversy shows us exactly why we need alternatives to both Western-dominated and elite intermediated approaches to global politics. Ubuntu Dunia provides that transformative vision.